We oftentimes have to make decisions that we're not able to coordinate our behavior with the other party before we make these decisions. And sometimes it'll be in our mutual interest if we chose one way, but in our individual interest to choose another way. And if we both choose that other way, it could actually be the worst outcome for our mutual interest. So when choosing, we often want to use game theory to understand those incentives, much like the Golden Balls episode you just watched. We call these non-cooperative games, and they're decisions that are made that affect people, but we're not able to coordinate our behavior beforehand, which causes us to choose an outcome that may not be in our best interest. So, for example, airlines have very, very high fixed costs and very low marginal costs when they fly a passenger from point A to point B. Let's say the marginal cost is $20, the average total cost is $300. As long as that airline can get at least $20, it's better off taking something, say $50, relative to having that seat sit empty. However, it's worse for the airline if it sells all of its seats for less than $300. And competition might force these two airlines or two more airlines to lower their price below average total cost simply to fill a seat. So this is an idea where they can't coordinate their behavior. They end up pricing that's in their worst or to their disadvantage. Employee compensation. We saw this with the NBA trying to negotiate with their players, where the NBA actually made a strategic failure or a move that was a strategic failure on its part. Having better understood game theory, they may have made a better decision. Negotiating with suppliers for goods and services and regulation are just some ideas of the things we use game theory to better understand. We look at two different types of games, a simultaneous game and a sequential game. With a simultaneous game, we both make a decision at the same time. We make it simultaneously, much like the contestants on Golden Balls both pick split or steal at the same time. The other option is sequential game. I move first, and then given my decision, you must make a decision. What we want to look at is when we think of things strategically, we want to look forward and reason back. We want to try to get the best idea that we can of what the other person is going to choose, and then we can reason backward and decide what our best strategy or what our best decision is going to be. So let's use the example of Prisoner's Dilemma, which is much like the Golden Balls episode. You have two people who rob a bank. The police pull them over. They're pretty certain they robbed a bank, but they have nothing to prove that they did. So they're not going to be able to get a conviction without their confession. They do have a slight, since they pulled them over, they found out there is some violation, let's say, driving without a license, whatever it is, that will impose a cost on them. Let's just say they'll spend 6 months in jail, half a year in jail. If they both can commit to remaining silent, they'll spend half a year in jail each. The red number is for the prisoner two's payout. The black number is prisoner one's payout. And if both remain silent, prisoner one spends half a year in jail, prisoner two spends half a year in jail. Notice that's the best possible outcome. It's in their mutual interest because the total cost of both of them is 1 year in prison. If they both confess, they end up with the worst possible outcome. Both of them go to prison for 8 years. That's a total of 16. That's the worst possible outcome combined. But notice that it's in their best interest individually to choose the confession option. So let's take a look at this. Regardless of what prisoner number one does, prisoner number two's best decision is to confess. If prisoner one remains silent, prisoner two can confess and not go to jail at all, relative to going to jail for half a year. If prisoner one confesses, then prisoner two certainly can confess and do better off by confessing, spending 8 years in jail as opposed to 10 years. If prisoner two decides to remain silent, prisoner one's best option is to confess. And then if prisoner two confesses, prisoner one's best option is also to confess. And now we can see that what's called a dominant strategy, that it's in both of their individual interests to choose to confess, and they end up with this strategy, which is the worst possible outcome of all. If the two could have coordinated their activity, they would have, but what happens is the police put both prisoners in different rooms, tell them that the other one is confessing to the whole thing, saying, you did it all. They're going to go to prison. They're going to walk free. You're going to go to prison. The other one's being told the same thing. So both of them have an incentive to confess because it's in their individual interest to do so, even though it's in their mutual interest to remain silent. But given that they were not able to coordinate their behavior beforehand and they couldn't monitor each other, they chose the worst possible outcome. We could see this with golden balls. Sarah and Steve had to decide whether to split or steal. They were splitting a total of 150 pounds. Comes out to about $142,000. I'm just going to make it an even 100,000 pounds. If they both choose a split ball, they both end up with 50,000 pounds. If they both choose the steal ball, they both end up with zero, the worst possible outcome. But notice that it is in their mutual interest to choose a split ball. That's a total largest total payout. It's in their individual interest to steal, regardless of what Sarah does. If Sarah chooses split, Steve gets 100,000 pounds versus 50,000 pounds if he is to steal. And if Sarah chooses steal, he certainly wants to choose steal. Matter of fact, he didn't, and that's why he was left unhappy. So I'm going to say that if he chooses split and Sarah chooses steal, he has negative 10 pounds just because he's frustrated and angry that she cheated. So his dominant strategy is to steal. Sarah, looking at the same thing, regardless of whether Steve decides to split or steal, if he chooses split, her best option is to steal. She gets 100,000 pounds versus 50,000 pounds. And if he chooses to steal, then her best option is to steal as well, because she doesn't want to walk away with him getting 100,000 pounds and her getting nothing. So she's going to choose the steal option as well. And we see that this is their best strategies for both to pick steal. If I were on that show, I would certainly pick steal every time. There's no way I would not pick steal for that same reason. It's a dominant strategy for both is to pick steal and steal. There can be some decisions that are made that could actually overcome this strategy. And we're going to take a look at these. One of the things to keep in mind is this was a one-time, one-shot game. If this game is to be repeated over a number of times, then you might have a strategy that develops where you're both cooperating and you're both ending up with split-split. And we'll take a look at that later. But for right now, what I want to look at is now watch the second Golden Balls video and see how one contestant overcame this decision problem and was able to get the other person to commit to split.